All righty, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the September 7th, 2023 meeting of the Lower Downtown Design Review Commission. Let's start with some introductions, and John, will start with you.
John McIntyre, Commissioner at Large.
Jim Gravener, resident.
Amy Sanborn, Preservation Architect.
Heather Vasquez Johnson, Chair and Practicing Architect.
Fred Glick, property owner.
Andy Duncan-Imke, Preservation Architect.
Craig Lawrence, architect and building owner operator.
Great.
And I'm Brittany Bryant, Denver Landmark Preservation staff, and this meeting was called to order at 8:30. And Fred, I think you're at large, actually.
Am I now?
I think so. I don't
Okay.
know for sure though.
I've
Either
moved,
at large or.
I've moved around a few times, so I've kind of lost track.
I think we're looking for property. No, so you might be property.
I think I'm property owner. I think I was at large and then I became property owner. And then if you need something else, I can adjust.
Switch around. Great. Okay. Get started. First thing on the agenda this morning is the meeting record for approval of June 1st. Actually, sorry, I'm gonna start got a little delayed on the slide. So start through with some audio tips for virtual participants. Anybody who is joining us on Zoom this morning. If you have any issues hearing, we recommend clicking on your audio settings to add background noise suppression. Put your speaker and microphone to maximum output. And then for anybody who is presenting as an applicant this morning or as a public commenter when it's your turn to speak, to mute and unmute, there's a microphone icon at the bottom of the screen. You can expand that menu to select speaker and microphone devices if you are working with that headset or AirPods or anything like that. And you should be able to test your microphone and speakers to get their volumes. And then if you're still having audio challenges, there is an option to switch to phone for audio. All right, so first thing on the agenda is the meeting record for approval from June 1st. That was sent out. Do any of the commissioners have any corrections or changes to that meeting record? I'm seeing a lot of shaking hands. We don't have to make a motion on that, correct? Okay, so no corrections or modifications to the meeting record from June 1st were noted. So first thing on our consent agenda this morning, we have two items. I will call each of the items. If any of the commissioners would like to pull any of those items off the consent agenda for any reason, commissioners can speak up. And we will move those to the design review. And if not, we will have someone make a motion. So this morning's consent agenda items consist of item 2023-COA-322, 1920 Market Street for a projecting sign, and item 2023-COA-320 at 1627 Market Street, also a projecting sign. Any commissioners have any desire to pull either of those off consent agenda this morning? Somebody care to make a motion?
Sure, I'll move to approve the consent agenda.
Thank you, Fred. You have a second? Okay, got Amy and Jim on that, so. All right, I'll go to Amy. I heard her first. Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, that consent agenda passes unanimously.
And if you're here for the consent agenda, you may leave, but you're welcome to stay if you would like.
Thank you, Brittany. Okay, moving into design review. A quick rundown of the process. There's one item on our design review today. So that will be our only one. If there are any commission members that have a conflict of interest or need to recuse, they will speak up. Staff will introduce the application, review their staff report and issue their recommendation. At that time, commissioners will ask any questions of staff. At that time, applicant will be invited to make their presentation, and they get 15 minutes today, Brittany. So because it's an infill project, applicant will have 15 minutes today. After the applicant's presentation, commissioners can ask questions. We'll then open it up for public comment on any of that. If there's anybody joining, at that point, we'll see if there are any staff clarifications. And commission will deliberate and make a motion and vote. So our first design review project is item 2023-COA 325-1801 Market Street.
So our first project today is for a new infill proposal at 1801 Market Street. Here is the an aerial image of the lower downtown historic district with the project site. It's between 18th and 19th along Market Street. And then it is.
I don't need to take off the words, but I have looked at this site with this client previously. Not working with the currently, so that's the issue.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
And that's a good point too. The business that I own operate is on the opposite side of the alley, on the Blake Street side. Again, I don't feel like there is a conflict of interest there. We can make clear decisions.
Thank you. So this project is within a special review district. There are 4 special review districts within the lower downtown historic district. Special review district 1, 2, and 3 allow for development that is 130 feet tall. So you can see the site outlined here. Special review district has its own design standards and guidelines due to its location adjacent to the creek. So here is the site plan for the project. It will be an entire block development. There will be a underground parking garage that is accessed off the alley. And the streetscape will be revitalized as part of this development. This site is currently a parking lot, so it will utilize a vacant parking lot within the district. I do have all the floor plans for this project. I will quickly go through them as it may be easier to look at this project in elevation and model. But this project will be entirely residential in use with the exception of the ground floor, which serves as a retail tenant space at the corner of 18th and Market, which is this lightly yellow shaded area here. The tenant entries will be located in a recess along Market Street. There are 2 tenant entries there in what staff is calling building zippers. So they are recessed from the street facade, but the project is built along the street edge as recommended per the lower downtown design guidelines, and access is across the alley, or access is off the alley, and the building will not cross the alley. So this is the second floor. This building is a mix of studio, 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom apartments. Again, I'll just quickly go through the floor plans for this project. I do have them all here. On the 3rd floor, the tenants that are along the alley will have outdoor patio space, which you can see reflected in this floor plan here. There will be balconies along the alley on the upper levels as well. These are projecting balconies, as you can see on the floor plans. Level 7 is pretty similar, with the exception that the building massing does start to shift, and there are some upper story setbacks along Market Street, which you can see represented in this location here, which is a rooftop terrace, and then just a shift in massing over here. Level 8 is the amenity space, and there will be a pool deck, so there is a significant upper story setback here as well. Level 9s through 11, and then level 12. So this is a 12-story building. The lower downtown design guidelines recommend buildings be at least 2 stories. Obviously, that is clearly meeting that guideline, as this is a 12-story building. Here is the rooftop plan. This building will have 2 elevator stair overruns located closer to the 18th and 19th Street Market side. These will be no taller than 10 feet as recommended by the design guidelines for lower downtown. However, they'll be minimally visible because from 18th and 19th, they're inset over 40 feet from the public right of way. And then with the building having upper story setbacks, they are significantly inset from Market Street as well, and the alley. So here is the building massing in terms of what the articulation looks like in the floor plan. So there are several shifts in the upper story massing that provide rooftop space and access. This is also showing where the building will have building balconies. So what staff are calling units 3 and 4, which is this darker gray unit here, module here. There will be balconies located below 55 feet, which the design guidelines do recommend against. However, staff do feel that they are well integrated into the design and are not significantly concerned about them, but they are not supported by the design guidelines. Here you can see the projecting balconies proposed for the rear alley elevation, and then the building has several building base modules and upper story terrace areas. So this is the Market Street elevation. This project proposal is 130 feet. Because this is in Special Review District 1, they are not required to provide a context study showing a building within context. However, the applicant has done a significant context study showing the surrounding building heights and how the building relates to the buildings in the surrounding context. The site across Market Street is also a 130-foot development, and I believe it is just now nearing construction completion, or it is finished with construction. It's finished with construction.
It's done.
Yes. So the building base for this building does have what staff are calling 5 modules across the Market Street facade, and then a more consistent upper story setback. There are some minor shifts in massing along the upper story as well, creating those rooftop deck spaces that we previously discussed. I do have detailed elevations, so we'll look at this building going from 18th to 19th. So this is the Market Street elevation along 18th Street. This is the corner tenant here will be the retail, commercial, potentially restaurant space. The tenant is accessed off of the Market Street entry. We do feel that some more visual prominence could be given to this tenant entry, as the bay is very similar to the adjacent bays, and the design guidelines do talk about visual prominence for building entries. This unit of measurement here is 103 feet for module 1, which is just slightly over what the design guidelines recommend for modules in the Lower Downtown Historic District. The Lower Downtown Historic District design guidelines recommend 100 feet. So it is slightly over the building base module. Module 1's height is 55 feet. Then the building transitions into a zipper, as we're calling it, where the upper story setback kind of comes down to the ground floor. This is the primary entrance for the residential units. It is recessed in the wall plane, which recessed entries are allowed by the Lower Downtown design guidelines. However, we feel additional visual prominence could be given to the residential entries as well. And then module 2 is 76 feet in height. It does have a, on the 7th floor, it's a kind of covered outdoor terrace balcony, but from the street, it will have the appearance of 76 feet in height. The building base has been designed to be reflective of the levels and floors that are required for buildings that are 55 feet in height and buildings that are 85 feet in height. So the guidelines do recommend for a building that is 4 stories in height, the exterior articulation of the appearance of 4 stories. So you have a clearly defined building base, a clearly defined second floor, floors 3 and 4 are kind of working in conjunction with each other, and then you have the top floor. Similarly, the 85-foot modules have the appearance of 6 stories. Again, the building base, 2nd floor, 3rd and 4th floor working in conjunction with each other, 5th floor, 6th and 7th working in conjunction, and then the rooftop kind of terrace space acting as a separate space. Staff do feel that this building does have a clearly defined base, middle, and top, with the building base and the upper story setback serving as the overall 3-story building module articulation. Here is the west side of the Market Street elevation. Again, this is building modules 3, 4, and 5. Staff are a little concerned that building modules 3 and 4 do have balconies below the 55-foot datum line, as the guidelines do talk about balconies not being designed in that location. The design guidelines also talk about that balconies shall be projecting. These balconies have been integrated into the building facade and do occur at the ground floor level, the second floor level, the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th level for module 3. Staff do feel that they are very well integrated into the design, and the recesses here do not negatively impact the surrounding context. And particularly as this building is all residential in use, having that outdoor space does activate the street, which is a goal of the lower downtown design guidelines, but they don't cleanly meet the guidelines in terms of intent there. Then finally, we have the building module, the 5th building module. This is located at the corner of 19th and Market, and will wrap onto 19th Street. The upper story setback is very similar across this building facade, with the exception of the design of the upper story setback above module 3. So this area here is set back from the lower facade, but it does have more relationship to the lower building base in terms of the articulation of openings and the arch design that is used across this building facade. So here are the 18th and 19th Street elevations. The 18th Street building base again is 55 feet in height, and it does relate to the height of the contributing building across the alley. And then you have the upper story setbacks. You can see they're fairly simple here at the corner of 18th and Market. And then along 19th Street, the building does have a transition in height. So it does step down to 55 feet in height to relate to the contributing building across the alley. Staff would like to point out that both of these modules have a canopy design that wraps from 18th and 19th Street onto Market Street. Our guidelines do talk about elements that are projecting from the facade are allowed. However, staff do have some concerns over the way this canopy is articulated, particularly along Market Street from the return around 18th as it goes across the building zipper, and then module 2. Finally, staff are very concerned about the number of building modules across the Market Street facade. So the design guidelines do talk about breaking up building massing along the 100-foot module, which this building generally is. However, there are several transitions in building height when the upper story setback is more consistent in design. And then while the building base is connected to the upper story setback with the use of the arch motif, each module uses a different articulation of that arch motif. And we feel that it could be more consistent across the facade to create more regular articulation. And particularly like when you look at each individual module, for example, the Market Street facade, you have several arches that don't relate to the adjacent bays. So for instance, you have this kind of, I guess, double arch here. Then you have square windows. So we do feel that there could be a greater study given to how the arch form is articulated at the building base to create more consistency in the building design. So again, here are those modules. Generally 100 to 85 feet with a slightly smaller module 4 that is 57 feet, and then the 5th module is 47 feet along Market, but that does wrap the corner onto the 19th Street. Again, just some additional modules showing how this building is articulated with its upper story setback and clearly defined building base within the district context. Some additional studies of how the building relates to the surrounding context. So the applicant has chosen to use the arch form, as it is a pretty prevalent form within this block of the Lower Downtown Historic District. So you can see how it relates to the building that is across the alley, which is this building here. This is the 18th Street facade, and then this is the 19th Street facade. So you can see how it's relating to those surrounding buildings. Again, we would probably recommend a restudy of how those arches are used individually, particularly where you have a triple arch design, a double arch design, and how that relates to the surrounding historic context. But generally speaking, this building does not have horizontal bands of windows, which is recommended by our design guidelines. And this building also has a larger storefront, which is recommended by our design guidelines. I did not include the building sections in my presentation, but I would like to point out that the minimum floor heights for the Lower Downtown Historic District are not being met by this project proposal. The ground floor is taller than the floors 2 through 11, and then it's still taller than floor 12, but floor 12 is taller than floors 2 through 11. These are preferences written into the guidelines that they meet a minimum and maximum, and it's just below those recommended minimums for all the floor heights for this building. And then finally, additional articulation and where the building forms are coming and how the building is not creating horizontal bands, and how the window design helps contribute to cohesive design, creating that appearance of connected floors. So finally, I do have some renderings of this project proposal to show how it relates to the surrounding historic context. So this is taken from the corner of 18th and Market. This is where the 55-foot building base module is at the building base, and then you can see the upper story setbacks. Again, the upper story setback is more consistent in design. There are some additional setbacks that allow for covered terraced balcony spaces that you can see a little bit better in the renderings, particularly at this level where the arch detail is still just an open floor, providing some screening there. This is along Market Street. This is the 5th building module, so the building module that wraps the corner. The recess for the residential tenant entry, which we're calling the building zippers. Again, we feel more visual prominence could be given to these residential entries. It is covered by a canopy, but we feel that it could have more visual prominence. And then module 4 and 5, and module, 4 and 3. And then module 3 is the one that has the more consistent design with the building based on the upper story setback. But as you can see in this rendering, it is set back from there. And then this is the 19th Street elevation looking from across the street. And that is it. At this time, staff are recommending denial of this project. We do feel that is moving in a very good direction and are very supportive of development on this vacant lot. And 130 feet is allowed for this site in terms of development, so we don't have concerns over the overall building height. However, we would like to see additional study given to the building base and the number of modules and the way that those bays on the fenestration pattern are articulated on the building base. So at this time, we're just recommending denial over concerns primarily related to the building base. We are very supportive of the arch motif and feel that it is a unique modern interpretation of forms that you see within the surrounding historic context.
Thank you, Brittany. Any commissioners have questions for staff? Friends?
Can you clarify for me on the floor height recommendation, is that exclusively how the bays appear from the exterior, or is that actual heights within the building?
So it's a preference within the design guidelines. The commission has in the past for large infill development given more preference to how the floors appear from the exterior than the actual articulation and number of floors.
But not totally clear
Is
from the
not totally
guidelines.
clear.
Okay, great, thank you.
What is the floor?
Let me pull up that specific guideline, so yeah, I think,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that'd be a good
It's-
question for the applicant, but it is in my staff report, sorry.
There's our 10.3, if that's what you're asking, with the 12th floor being 11'1". And for the upper levels, the minimum reference is 11 feet and the max and
I'd like to discuss it, but let's discuss it when we go to discussion.
So it says-
Questions about that.
Appearance of heights, exterior expression of a 55-foot high building shall read up to 4 stories. Preference, the exterior expression of an 85-foot high building should read up as 6 stories. Again, this is in special review district 1, where you have a 130-foot building, which is allowable, and most of the lower downtown historic district, you can only build up to 85 feet. And then preference, again, as Amy said, for the street level minimum is 14 feet, which I believe the ground floor here is, I want to say 13.
It's, I think,
Or
it's 14 from what they're calling level
Okay.
1, but the base plane looks like it's a
Yeah.
little higher,
Yeah.
but we can discuss that too.
And then for the maximum for the street level is 20, and then for upper story is 11 for minimum and 14 for the maximum, and they're just a little bit under the minimum there as well. But it is a preference and not a standard that they have to meet.
Any more questions for staff?
Question. Has Dottie been informed of this project?
So.
Project, or have they been discussed, has it been discussed with them?
So this project is going through the site development plan review through the city, in which Dottie is tagged as a reviewer on that. I believe they're still in the concept submittal phase. And one of the big reasons they're still in concept is because we cannot release it from concept until you, the commission, approve this in terms of mass form and context, as it requires a super majority of 6 to pass a project within a special review district. But I think the applicant can probably answer additional questions regarding Dottie review if you have them.
Because my question is basically representing the residents of lower downtown. There have been a lot of cases recently where Dottie has not even informed the residents of what they're doing. Like the whole striking ban, the whole issue of downtown streets was never brought up at a meeting where we had residents of downtown involved.
Yeah.
And it seems to me there's an opportunity there for them to be closely involved, because they do represent 25% of the land area run in lower downtown,
Sure.
and as such are a major contributor to. And secondly, what they've been doing with the striping, while in general we are highly supportive of it, there are a number of exceptions.
Sure.
As we found. So I would put that as a comment. I don't know where exactly it fits in the program really, but wherever it fits, it should be, we should be allowed to weigh in.
Sure. I think, Dottie is not required to reach out to Denver Landmark for those types of things, as we don't have purview over that, but we have heard several complaints about some of the designs in our historic district.
Yeah, I know you have, but
Yeah.
just wanted to get that on the record. Thank you.
Any more questions for staff pertaining to this application? Okay, and the applicant is here.
I'm gonna turn the video. And then do I have access to our? You don't, the commission does have your entire packet, so if there are specific pages you want to reference, they're available, and then I can change the slides if there's like in my presentation, particular ones you want to see.
Okay.
And then don't start until I pull up the timer.
And if you can start with your name and address for the record.
Start now?
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Lauren Page with Open Studio Architecture at 1010 Park Avenue. Okay. Do you have our history slide from
I
our
don't have
presentation?
those, they're
Okay.
in the packet.
If anyone wants to reference it, it is page 6 of our application. The image that I want to focus on though is actually this small black and white image that's actually on the screen already. This was the site before these buildings were demolished. And we wanted to kind of go over a few things that Brittany hasn't talked about in her presentation. I don't want to take all the 15 minutes because she actually did a great job covering pretty much everything about the building. I just want to point out a few things that were really important to us in the design and also discuss a few elements that were brought up in the staff report. So first, in that historic image, you see the base articulation of those buildings. While this is the only image we had and there wasn't extensive history on it, we took some cues from the visual that we had. It has what appears to be either a cast iron or a stone base that creates more of like a lattice texture to it, with the buildings above matching that texture. The building towards 19th Street has a much lower profile and is masonry construction. It also, it steps down about, it's 1 story. It looks more like a 2-story step because of the height of the floors of the buildings adjacent to it. And then the last element I wanted to point out was the change in topography of those buildings, and then the misalignment that you see of those floors. So those 2 modules are very similar in design, but as the topography of the site slopes up, that center module steps up and those floors misalign. Next, if we could go to that massing view, it's slide 19 of our application, but it was the kind of aerial axon view that was a line drawing with the blue lines on top of it. Yes, that one. Looking at this slide, the most important thing that we focused on for the corners was the relationship to the buildings across the alley. So as you can see here, this view is viewing from 18th Street, and we were trying to match the height of the buildings there to create our base at the corner. So as it was noted, this corner module at 18th is the lowest on the site, but we created that volume is actually the largest in plan to kind of give it some emphasis, but allow it to align with the context across the alley. This is also the module that Brittany noted has the retail in it, and giving that a nice large footprint was important to us to activate that corner, as it is adjacent to the main entry that Brittany pointed out as called the zipper adjacent to it. And we wanted to activate that corner as well as the main entry to the residential building. The stepping of the buildings was a bit of a cue from some existing contributing buildings that are nearby. So it's not adjacent to the site, but down on between 16th and 17th on Market, the contributing buildings on that block have quite a bit of stepping in them rather than just a change in material. There are some that the modules just have a change in material, and there are some that also step in height and have some differentiation in that way. And we wanted to create kind of a contrast to the building across Market that just completed construction, where there's a change in just materiality, we used the steps and heights to define those modules a little bit more. Another element I think it's slide 20. In our application, I'm not sure which one it is in your view, but let me give you a description of it to get there. It was an elevation view of our arched windows with the building next door. Yeah, that's it. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this mass on 18th. I already mentioned that we were trying to match the building heights. So we've also talked about floor to floor heights a little bit today. One of the reasons we chose these floor to floor heights was to get some alignments with the buildings next door. So you can see while our floor to floors aren't matching, we're trying to, there's a solid band that is at the center of those rectangular windows, and we're trying to match how that building adjacent to us, that contributing building, has that solid layer. So that is one of the things contributing to our floor to floor height. And then on the elevation to the right, that's 19th Street, we are aligning with, if I can point to it here, that building doesn't create those vertical bands that you see on the other building, but we wanted to have some consistency with the corners of our building. So we still wanted to align our central band of our third and fourth floor. We have a solid band that runs through there that aligns with the banding of the building across the alley. So we're trying to create some alignments here. And that is both creating that stepping, that lower volume on or module on 18th Street, and the floor to floor height that we selected. Another thing I wanted to point out, if you go to the renderings, that one you just passed would probably be the best one. Okay, here you can see, I think this was brought up in the staff report as well, where the articulation of the floor lines are not aligning in those two buildings. And that, again, if you recall the discussion of the buildings that were on the site originally, we were trying to nod to that a little bit by we didn't want to do it in every building and create too much disruption of that facade. But we chose to kind of the two buildings that look the most similar, which are I think you called them modules 3 and 4. So they have the same facade design, but we allow that to be kind of the central point of the site where those facades shift. And so the buildings that are to the north of the site have floor alignments that all follow through. And then the buildings to the south of the site have all floor lines that follow through. So while those do create a shift in the visual, we only wanted to do it one time to kind of nod to the historical context that was on the site previously. If you go to the first rendering, I think it's the next, I'll kind of wrap up our point of view with this view. Again, this view is showing you that adjacent building of the contributing building, the alignments there. We wanted to create a base that had the detailing and texture of the contributing buildings and the historic context, but we wanted to allow the penthouse to kind of fade away and be a little bit more fuzzy and repetitive and not as detailed, to kind of give that emphasis to the base. And then Brittany mentioned the arched modules and how we have differences. So if you look at the historic building shown on the top right, top left image, it's kind of a mix of these window sizes and arches and rectangles, which we nodded to, but we also, the modules are very repetitive at the center of the building. So anything that's not on a corner is the same size. we have the arches at the top floor and the corners. So there is a rhyme and reason behind those windows that we allow those corners to grow a little bit wider. The solid parts are always the same size, but the window grows wider at those corners to accommodate an emphasis on the corners of each part of the building. I want to thank the Design Commission and Landmark staff for looking at this and talking to us about it today. We're pretty excited about getting this site, working on the site and designing this. So I'm happy to hear your comments. We included a little bit more information on the actual design to get kind of an idea of your feedback for phase 2 as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. Anybody have any questions for the applicant? Tim?
Did the applicant take pay any attention to the traffic patterns that might be created? Lack of parking in downtown, and the difficulty in finding parking downtown.
We have underground parking as well as one kind of quarter tray of parking that goes, I don't know if you have the second floor. I do on there. And while I don't actually recall,
Is that adequate to meet needs of the building,
yes,
including residential as well as retail?
yes.
Okay, thank you.
And we're also setting back, we didn't want to, the 18th, I know you're talking more about, you were talking about striping earlier and some improvements. We looked at the option of rebuilding the curb on 18th, but decided that we gave a foot to that sidewalk. We set the building back rather than revising the curb at all because of that bike lane that it looked like it was recently improved there.
Yeah.
So we didn't want to touch that, and we decided to push the building back instead of that was ahead of getting those comments.
I noticed the sketches, the artwork has basically no relation to what is there now. It's in terms of bike lanes, lack of curb parking, lack of any kind of parking facility on the street. And that's been one of the issues that has risen to prominence in the lower downtown area. So it's not just your particular site, it's the fact that 25% of the land area roughly of lower downtown is streets and roads. And that is causing, because of the way it's been developed, which I have no problems with, by the way, but it does cause more pressure to be given to some of the streets and roads, to some of the provisions of off-street and garaging. Normally, residential land area requires more spaces per usage than on-street parking for retail. And that's common.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how that affects what we're doing here. But the issue of that issue has become important in lower downtown. That plus the fact that in the historic district, which is outside of your control, to realize, but there are many violations of the 2001 approved plan for development of lower downtown, which have been ignored in recent developments. And that's again not your control, but it does have an impact, and it does have an overflow impact. So just one on the record there. Brittany, you're well familiar with those. The 20-foot sidewalk rule was part of the 2002 approved plan for lower downtown, is violated almost continuously. And there are places where it can't be done because the lower level basement is given over to other uses. And therefore you can't close off part of the sidewalk. So these are just difficulties which neighbors have problems with.
Any other questions for the applicant? Thanks, Jim. John, did you have a question?
No, I just did some work and looked at the elevation, so that's good.
Okay.
I'll just maybe as part of it, it can just, the construction types is concrete.
Yes, PT.
And I guess one more just in terms of where you're at from a design stage standpoint.
We're in schematic.
Any other questions? Going once, going twice. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ready to do have any follow-up? Public first. Okay, is there anybody from the public wishing to speak on that? There is nobody here present in person. If there's anybody online, please raise your hand so that we know that you would like to speak. Dick, did you have a comment? Can you raise your hand again for us, please? Taylor will need to allow you to speak. And you'll have to unmute. Okay. Okay, last call, any public comment, please raise your hand. Okay, seeing none, any staff recap?
I do not have a major recap. I wasn't so much concerned with the articulation of the floor heights and where they're expressed. It's more the individual bay fenestration patterns and the number of modules across the building facade. So just for clarity, as downtown definitely has different floor to floor height expressions on the historic buildings, and you don't necessarily see like a totally symmetrical across the board facade.
Great. Thank you, Brittany. We will close comments and open deliberation. What's everybody think? Fred?
I want to go into some specific pieces as opposed to giving an overview, but I do want to talk a little bit about that ground floor height. Because I think as I look at the elevations and as I look at some of the sections, I worry that as we get toward 19th, even though we started and we've got a consistent first floor height at 14.4 from one side, it does get quite a bit smaller as we move across the building. And I worry about that partially because I worry about the impact on the street. I think as we look at that, this building, I think unlike most of what we see in Lodo, does have a real block of residential across that ground floor. And that we know from history that that's not going to be terribly active. I think there's a hope that with some of the recessed balconies on the ground floor that might be. I worry a little bit about whether that will or not. Looking at the sections, it appears that a lot of those units as we move toward 19th have pretty low ceiling heights inside the ground floor. So I worry that we're going to have some fairly less desirable units that are going to close themselves off from the street. I think it also then starts to relate to staff's expressed concern about the lack of prominence of the residential entries. And particularly that one, as we move again toward 19, looking at the section of that residential lobby has quite a low ceiling height, it appears. I'm not sure what that really ends up being, but I think if you look at section I think if you look at section E in terms of the residential units at that stage and get into, and even more so with section F. And then section G with that secondary residential lobby that looks like its ceiling heights are lower than the units above it. I just, even though the building has got that datum line across, I fear that those low ceiling heights inside are going to reflect outside in a way that's not good for the street activation, for the feel of that street. So
just discussing that one piece for a little bit, because
yeah,
I have similar, I think similar concerns, and again, this is all the messing, but I know you've got additional detail in there. I think relative to the expression of residential against the street edge, and what type of facade system, like landscape condition, stoop condition, actually makes that residential to sidewalk transition work really successfully. At the moment, there's not a lot of distinction between what's a retail storefront at that ground floor and what's a residential storefront at that ground floor. And I think there's a ton of examples around the city of full resolution of residential to sidewalk interface at the ground floor. And it requires some kind of a depth, some kind of a landscape transition, or some kind of elevation change to enable a kind of a stoop condition for that relationship between sidewalk and residents at grade to be successful. And so I think there needs to be enough generosity in this section, and potentially in the plan at that ground floor, not to say that it needs to be open to sky, but I just think we do need to be aware of that kind of sense of activating what residential needs to be against the sidewalk, and what it takes to have a kind of a successful condition, because it's not the same as a retail condition. You know, sidewalk butting into glass doesn't work, but floor to ceiling glass for ground floor residential. I think it's some thought into maybe how the character of the residential comes to ground, which I still think could enhance that base middle top, and just offer a difference between the retail component and the residential component that hits the street. Because residential at ground level is tough. It's tough to make that interface feel good, feel successful, and there's elements that it needs to do, whether it's to do with ceiling heights, the ability to make a stoop or step up a little bit of the units or do something to give that relationship.
it may or may not, height may or may not be the answer, but there's an answer needed.
I think so. This is maybe leading into the next round in some ways, because it's to do with facade articulation, but I think it is also to do with massing and base build top.
Yeah, I mean, we do usually kind of review and look at openings and proportion as part of mass form and context, because it ties into that form. So the actual details of the windows would be phase 2, but the size, the proportion, those things are valid things to talk about in this phase of it. Fred, I agree with your comment. I have some concerns about, that 14-foot kind of first level and how much of that gets eaten away as the grade moves up towards 19th. I'm also struggling a little bit with the proportion of that. And what I'm seeing that the applicant is really kind of focusing on, in particular, the 55 and 85 foot modules, and, with the 55 having it reference 4 stories and, 85 referencing 6, is I feel like that first level, and some of it I think has to do with the height as it moves across grade up to 19th, that first level feels really squashed. And I keep kind of looking, and I understand that there's a desire to try to find some alignment with the buildings across the alley on 18th and 19th, but I'm feeling like there's potential for this to maybe be a little more successful and to give a feeling of more height and more opening on that ground level, if the articulation to give an appearance of a 4-story building happened on 1 and 2, and less so on levels 3 and 4. to help make that base a little bit stronger, and a little bit more prominent. It's feeling squashed to me, very much so, especially with that canopy that comes across. That's adding to that feeling of compression at the ground
And
level.
you suggested, which I maybe agree with, that kind of piano noble floor, that kind of like narrow second floor, if it was down, that was the first floor.
Yeah.
Might give additional.
Yeah, those second
without a
level,
shed, might give additional scale.
those second level windows feel very squashed also, and I think that kind of creating 1 and 2 to feel like one large grand first level, even if there are 2 actual physical stories in there, may help with the proportion on that a little bit.
Yeah, I concur with that. I mean, and it would give better context with the building adjacent, facing 18. That floor to floor height looks larger, although it's kind of difficult to tell, but it looks like it's probably closer to 18 feet. But even just some alignment with, the canopy there adjacent, I agree with you. I think it could be just that it's visually like integrated with like the transom windows kind of above, like second story windows.
It feels like the floor to floor heights have been designed to ensure that they get an extra floor of units in there. And I think it's hurting the building. And I would tie that, frankly, while I appreciate the attempts to reference the historic forms that were there, I think there's this difficult balance that we're not always dealing with well here, both architecturally and frankly from a code standpoint, from a zoning code standpoint across the city, of this idea that we want to break up larger facades and have modules and bays, and balancing that between creating that and creating a cohesive whole. I think we often try to pretend that we're making multiple buildings on a block when we're not. And I don't know that creating modules means that we have to pretend we're creating multiple buildings. And so I'm not sure that the changes in height of those modules along Market are always successful and might benefit from more uniformity in height, in my mind, which might help to alleviate the issue of trying to get an extra floor in there. Because frankly, if you took some of them up more, you'd have more units, and maybe that might help to make the numbers work and balance that out better.
I agree with you in that sense that, well, I'll take it a little bit further, and I think that variations in height are being used to define the base, middle, top. But if you look at it from a pure massing standpoint, there's really only a base and a top with a few step backs. So I don't feel like we're meeting the intent of standards to have a true base, middle, top. I'm okay with the extra, squeezing that extra floor in there via the reduction in heights, because it's housing and we need the housing. So, but I agree with you, Fred, that by readjusting or massaging some of these height articulations and some of the proportions, we can better accommodate that extra floor that fits in there. So my main critiques are one, that the mass seems to be missing either a top or a middle. It's only has 2 of the 2 components of the 3 components, and the alignment that we see between modules 3 and 4, or I should say the misalignment, I feel is it's not working in the historic context. We see misalignments of floors in the historic context, but in the image that the applicant presented, it was due to grade, and the floors were all consistent because grade was changing. The alignment changed. Here, we're just splitting it in half, and that creates a lot of visual noise, especially when it's split in half across 2 modules that are essentially the same articulation. So I just feel that that's not meeting the intent then of the variations in width component of the standards.
Yeah, I agree with that. When to kind of add on to it, like I'm looking at modules 1 and 2, kind of the first one's from 18th over on Market, and they have very similar articulation, and I feel like those are more successful because there's a greater vertical shift in the height, but there's also that break with that zipper in the middle. And I think that kind of looking at that, the 3 and 4 module and having, whether it's some changing plane in the opposite direction to help kind of define that a little bit, or a different change in verticality. I also felt that way about as it turns and it goes on to 19th Street, and that you have a step in the kind of parapet vertical condition and height that goes across 19th Street, but it's a similar articulation. It looks to be proposed in a similar material, and there's no kind of change in plane or break between those verticals. It just feels like that haircut.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with having cleaner modularity at the base. And I think just better articulation, or just cleaner articulation just in some of the historic documents too, you know, they can have like triptych windows or paired windows. So I think, you know, some of that historic context could be just articulated a little bit cleaner in the base. The 10-3 doesn't bother me. I agree. I think we need housing. I think obviously they're, you know, trying to meet this 130-foot maximum. I just think that at the base level, if we had cleaner articulation, I think it wouldn't be so concerning, and perhaps some curtain wall with some spandrel in those areas to help, you know, elongate levels at the base.
Jim?
There are certainly a number of areas or downtown where things like loading docks have caused buildings to be built at different elevations for the first floor and second floor. Now, building we're in right now has a loading dock on the first floor, which has caused problems. Some of the buildings downtown don't have loading docks, some do. And that is an excuse which can be used to further build areas with different elevations and different, to get to Fred's point, to get different elevations for first and second floor. It's a reason to do it. And I would suggest that there are buildings downtown which were built at grade built into the building. For instance, the building we're in right now has about an 1/8 inch per foot grade built into it, which allowed horse cars to be brought out with one man pushing them, rather than having to keep a team of horses to pull them out. So that kind of thing is very common in an older section of downtown.
I do want to say, I like the use of negative space along Market. I like the recessed balconies. I think that can be very interesting, and that can create some interesting elements. And I think, you know, using it higher up as well, some of those open arches, that kind of thing is pretty interesting, and that works for me. I do worry a little bit about those negative spaces at the ground floor and how that really works. And I think that whole ground floor street wall needs to be thought through. Again, I just worry that some of those ground floor balconies, recesses, the way they're structured are going to be sort of dark holes that residents might not use, that just collect trash. I worry about these fairly small residential entries that are recessed back and not feeling particularly safe, frankly, and not feeling particularly welcoming or warm as a pedestrian environment. So that I'm much more comfortable with what's been done on L2 and above. But at the ground floor, I think that whole thing makes me a little nervous.
We just building on a couple of these comments to give some clarity to the end. But the base middle top thing, I do think does exist with that lower base. I think some better articulation of what residential is at a street versus what residential is at above will help that reading. And I also think the logic of maybe increasing the height of that by folding the kind of piano and overlay floor, the second floor into the base would help with that reading too. And then I do see the kind of, you know, predominantly masonry middle, the sort of double-story articulated base that's changing character. And ironically, it's like, when you move from the residential above to the retail below, it makes sense to kind of expand in like the way I think the building does. But I think it would be interesting to consider the fact that it's almost the opposite when you go with residential from above to below, that in fact there's a sort of, there's more privacy and more interface with street, sort of some different complexity about the residential to sidewalk that may make it go the opposite way, that it needs to be maybe dense in the base rather than more open to go with the fact that people are trying to live at street level. So I think that basement top can exist, but it could be strengthened to the diagram. The kind of laciness of the top and the rims at least is interesting, I think, and it's providing kind of a, feels like an appropriately screen-like, more abstract kind of ground element at the top. It feels to me though, there's just a lot of like different ways of dealing with a similar condition. Sometimes there's a zipper where the set system from the top drops to the ground. Sometimes the buildings are butted against each other. There's lots of different versions of arched corners. There's typical ones, there's the wider ones, there's one where there's a solid corner, there's one where there's an open corner. Given the complexity of the scheme overall, it feels like maybe just refining the approach with corner conditions and scene conditions to maybe like get it a little bit and just kind of might help strengthen to the relationship between the forms, because I think that's a little bit about, I like the articulation on 19 of 3 different volumes, but it feels to me like it's kind of missing zipper. Like one way to articulate the 2 brick volumes just like hitting each other, and I'm looking at page 58 of your presentation, the render of the view on 19 would be to introduce some version of a scene to enable the masses to separate a little bit. And I also feel like that might actually benefit the 18th Street elevation too, because it does feel to me like part of what's compressing that ground floor, particularly on the 18th Street end, is the fact that that corner block is trying to stay quite low. Maybe 1 more floor on that block with a help with this double order at the bottom. That maybe there's a stair that occurs. It's nice the 55 alignment, you know, across the alley, but maybe the corner could elevate itself a little bit to sort of help push it there, because it does feel like there's a lot of top and a lot less base on the 18th corner. And then maybe I personally like the finer articulation on 18th and 19th short-sided blocks. The fact that there might be a couple of conditions there feels good. But to me, that pedestrian proton and pedestrian grain has a little bit more going on rather than just one building. And so it feels like 19 is a little bit more successful.
I'm still stuck on the ground floor, but some of what was just said makes me want to throw out there, you know, talking about how to make those livable and so that they do interface with the sidewalk. I think it's pretty tough when you put a very small studio apartment right on the ground floor for it to feel livable, for it to want to interface with the street. I think it's much different when you look at the ground floor. Less is the least desirable space in the building, which is kind of how it feels to me right now from the sections and from the plan. It feels to me like you've kind of said, these are going to be the cheap apartments and we're just kind of going to throw them down there. I think there are good examples where the ground floor has actually been seen as being a benefit and has moved to trying to be more of a townhouse structure or something like that, or 2 levels, things like that, where suddenly those ground floor units really do have an interesting relationship with the street and are very desirable units. And that affects how they interface with the street. So I wonder if you might want to think about that a little bit, because it really does feel to me right now like those are totally the least desirable. I mean, they're tiny little skinny studios. They're going to be dark, especially where they're set. But, you know, we've got the setback balcony. They're not going to get much light at all. It just feels to me like we're asking for them to be problematic and to be a problem along the street.
And maybe a duplex will also let you do something, maintaining the floor to floors, but bitter about it, but masonry construction versus typical construction. It, that could be an interesting idea to try and elevate. I agree that somehow those units need to feel special, so that they become attractive and they don't just become something that's very.
I agree with those comments. I am looking at the ground floor plan and it looks like they're all 1 bedrooms or 2 bedrooms, not studios. It looks like the studios don't start at level 2. But I think the comments are all still really relative of making sure that those units don't feel like the worst ones in the building and kind of an afterthought, so that they are really kind of interactive with the street and you get more engagement. So it's not just people drawing their curtains and turning their back to the street.
We need to trace the number of modules. No, it was. Brittany was there. I mean, just to give some direction there in terms of how that feels.
I think you addressed it in various ways. You have something more specific to say?
I was just wondering, given that it was coming from you, make sure the evidence felt like we were clear there in terms of like the amount of variation in the number of modules along module.
It doesn't bother me that
That's
much. Like I look back across at the buildings across the street, the Fitzgerald, I think that has 5 modules across the front also, so I don't. And also kind of referencing the notion of the inset balconies within that first 55 feet, and that building also has some of those too. So I think that there's rationale, and there's precedent for that. I think it's the bigger questions of kind of the proportion and the changing point that need to be addressed that could help that.
One thing I'll mention about modules though is that between module, the similarity of 3 and 4, exclusive of any recessed balcony or recessed entry massaging that could occur as presented, I think from a pedestrian experience would feel almost the same. So you end up with one module that's almost 140 feet long. But I think a lot of what we've discussed here will help to resolve that.
And you're right, I'm sorry, I misspoke on that, on the studios on the ground floor.
That's okay, it's just on the record. I'll make sure.
No, you're right, thank you.
I do, kind of looking at it, I agree with staff, like, I'm supportive of the idea of kind of taking the arch and doing it in a modern way. I do have some concerns about a couple of the ones on the corners in particular, that just feel proportionally too wide. And I asked the applicant to kind of really study the width to height ratio on those.
That's a proportion thing, right?
It's a proportion thing, yeah. And then kind of when you look at the ones on the corners with kind of the triple arches, again, those ones on the top, they're really squashed, I think, because they are so wide. And there may be some cues to be taken from the district of, maybe it's 2 windows that are narrower that fit that same overall width and have a solid piece in the center, which might be a little more successful. Also kind of looking at the recessed portion up above. We haven't really touched on that all that much. I'm really curious to see how things will be detailed when this project gets to a phase 2 point. I have some concerns just about how much solid remains in between each of those arches. There are some locations where it feels like it's very, very heavy on void. And that it may be just how it's graphically being presented, but it feels like there's very, very narrow elements of solid compared to very wide elements of void, and the proportion of that feels a little bit off. And it is recessed and it's upper and it's secondary. I just still think it needs another look and a little more study on that. I'm also a little concerned about how much the building sets back on the 19th Street elevation at only being at 3 feet. Feels like it wants to have a little bit more. I think that the 18th Street setback at like 8'4". I'm looking at page 36 on the applicant's presentation. There's 8'4" on the 18th Street side, and that feels a little more successful. It feels like there's a little more breathing room. On 19th Street, it really feels like that upper story is still slammed up against 19th Street, and it might help with the scale of some of that base if that was recessed even just a couple more feet and set back just a little bit more up there. the dimensions are in the elevation, but you can kind of see it in the renderings too, or it feels like there's not enough setback, and it kind of towers over some of those things that are not necessarily across the alley, but across 18th and across 19th.
Which I would then argue also created. Very monolith, you know, that upper portion.
Heather, the reason that you had split arched windows in the days when those buildings were built, so that you could put a fireplace in between. And the fireplace dictated the chimney size, which went on up. The other thing I mentioned that is probably maybe is that currently our company does not have the capability of allowing individual things to have power distributed to all units in the garage, which has caused some very serious problems with buildings who would like to be equipped for electric vehicles, but can't be. So that's another issue that we need some assistance with from you, please.
Yes.
I think the image on page 60, the last print really finds out the idea of that additional data on the SIP page. And I think also the idea of potentially some articulation between the low brick mass and the high brick mass adjacent to the 5 stories of the other, which I think would help and be pretty consistent with the language of all. On there's some specific feedback on entrances. Personally, I'm all for like I think it's important that you know where entrances are. Like I think residential entrances in particular want to have a sort of a discreteness to them in some way. So I think in my mind that might be more to do with the craft of the canopy, some moment of signage, maybe elevating material language around the entrances to sort of draw you to them. But I guess
Lighting.
personally, I think understated residential entrances buildings are great. They just want to have that craft, and I think a little bit more attention on the balcony condition and how that interacts and projects those entrances in the single look. That can make sense. It's just a little bit more detail and materiality crafted.
Also just gonna say I'm a little concerned about the upside down arches in module 3 and 4. That seems like a waterproofing nightmare. But that's not my challenge to solve. So I'm just gonna put that out there.
It's also district.
Yeah.
I don't think we've seen that.
We haven't. I mean, I think you could make an argument that it's a modern interpretation of it, but I'm not loving the upside down arches.
Yeah, it
for
goes
lot of
back
reasons.
to a prior chair. I would say it was a dealer's choice, but it's
Yeah.
not one that I would make. That's personal.
It just looks like a very inviting place to nap. And if I was living in that unit, I would
Well,
not love having a
I'm also thinking of
curvy view right outside my.
talking about Masonry Institute and detailing a brick soldier course going down there, and I'm just like, that's just inviting water to get in each button there.
Yeah. It's not for us to solve.
Not for us to solve. So to throw in 2 cents. I do agree with John that I think if you increase the height of that first floor from piano nobly, I think that would create a much more substantial first floor. I do see basement on top, but I agree the base seems kind of weak for as big as this building is. The top I'm seeing is that setback condition. So I'm kind of liking the fact that it creates an entire mask, but I do have concerns. It's like, how is that detailed and what's the solid void relationship? I think it could be a little too modern, so I think that would be interesting to see fleshed out. My biggest critique in terms of guidelines is I feel like there's a lot of visual noise going on, especially in the base. And I feel like, well, not the base, but the middle. And I do like how the arched windows does relate to other buildings, but I feel like it's using the vocabulary, but not correctly. And I feel like it's almost used too much and there's too much height variation in terms you've got, different sizes of the arch that creates the proportional issue that we talked about. We've got them at all levels, at different modules. So it's kind of your eye doesn't quite know where to go. I feel like portions of the building are very successful in how they set up a vertical alignment, how you would have seen in other historic buildings, but in other areas where you've got the double or triple arch, I think it just creates a lot of clutter. I think for the most part, I feel like it could be calmed down a little bit. And then there's other areas that I feel like I'm looking at module 3 along Market Street, which I kind of get, but at the same time, it just seems totally foreign in the historic district. Like I'm having a hard time seeing how there's just so much noise. It's hard for me to understand how that's relating to other buildings in the historic district. And then minor, but what are our thoughts of how on module 4, where we've got the open corner, which seems to me a little foreign in the lower downtown district? Like I'd want to see a solid corner and not a voided corner.
Yeah, I think that goes back to the comment I made too about a little bit of just maybe establishing a condition. A bit more consistency. Treatment.
Considering we had past session, this group, I think we had an area where they were closing in a corner.
But that was,
And that went through unanimously.
but I think the difference there is that was a modern building. That was very modern. This one's, it's a new building, but it's also using a lot of historic components, which is why I'm having the issues with rectifying that.
Exactly.
If it went completely modern, it'd be like open corner, fine. But this is, they're trying to relate to historic components, and that's why I'm like, it's jarring to me.
And I think the arch is challenging, right? Because it's.
Yeah.
It is such a proportional thing, and this kind of a rate to it. So I think part of it is just having time to work through the rigor of the modules to get it all laid. So yeah, it gets more refined.
My opinion on the corner is it's a bit of a dealer's choice if it's done well and it relates to items on the board. But I mean, I could go either way. I don't think it's necessarily successful. Or it's not contextual, it's just a little boring right now.
Would note that I feel like this is one of the least projects, one of the toughest types of projects that.
Yeah, I agree.
A really hard type of project that affects the full part of the bottom. Really significant. And as of right,
Uses.
yeah, so it's a kind of the question of the modern historic city, right? How do you do these things? So it's I think it's good to be, there'll be a lot of conversation about it, about it's an exciting project, and it's great to see this density of everything.
There's some really sophisticated, nice design moves here. I really love like the juxtaposition of like the laciness of the top compared to the base. And I think if that was cleaned up a little bit, just articulated a little more consistently, I think, that juxtaposition would be even more like relevant.
I agree. It's like if there was more of a contrast between the laciness at the top and then a solidness at the bottom. Right now, it's kind of like in between. I want to see the bottom made heavier, so the top can
just breathe more. Yeah.
Like I feel like right now they're competing, and I want one to be like, "Here I am," the other one to be like, "Gotcha." Totally.
Well, I think we've given the applicant a lot of feedback and comments. Is there anything else that anyone would like to add?
I think the only thing I would add is I know sometimes, and I learned this from the last commission, it's like, I do appreciate where it's going. I feel like there's a lot of good moves, a lot of good components. Just think it needs some refining.
I would just maybe prompt thinking that the 10-foot 3 I like the additional floor of units, if you can make it work, I think it's, it's the applicant's thing to make work. But it's a very tight floor to floor, and it's very deep, in this plan at 40 to 44 feet because of the modular block, so. I guess just from past experience, a note of, caution on the floor to floor, even with the concrete construction, with that depth of unit. But I think it's the applicant's decision to make on that. If they can make it work and it's leasable and functional and effective, then the additional floor of units is worth it for what it does. So.
Anything further? Anybody care to make a motion?
Sure, I will, because I have it right here.
Here you go.
I move to deny application 2023 COA 325 for the phase 1 mass form and context at 1801 Market Street for design guidelines for new buildings, principle 4, 5, 6, and policies 4.1, 4.2, 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, presented testimony, submitted documentation, and information provided in the staff report.
Thank you, Fred. A second.
I'll second.
Thank you, Andy. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. So that will close design review. Do we have any business items or discussion items today?
Just a few short things. I don't know if you guys noticed the new face at the staff table. This is Andrew Abbey. This is his second week with the city. He is our new staff planner. If you want to do a brief introduction, that's up to you.
Yeah, I've been in them for just over a year now. I'm from Buffalo, New York. In the private sector, a background in architecture, urban planning, and historic preservation. And I'm really excited to be part of the team. Nice to meet you all. Welcome.
And you may or may not have heard, but we are updating our general design guidelines again. This is our phase 2 update, and we are kicking off with topic-based community meetings. We had a meeting last night virtually, specifically focused on windows, and we will have another windows focused meeting on September 12th. It's in person at the Carla Madison Rec Center. It's from 6:30 to 7:30. Same information will be presented as the virtual meeting. We're also recording those meetings so you can watch them online. But this update, we will focus on windows, accessory dwelling units, accessibility issues, and other small accessory structures, and then also signage. So for you guys, the biggest impact is probably windows, because you do have your own guidelines for signage. You don't have ADUs in lower downtown. And accessibility might impact you guys as well, but generally speaking, the general guidelines are the main guidelines, but the lower downtown guidelines are supplemental, and when they conflict, the lower downtown design guidelines apply more strenuously. So if you have any questions about that, I'm leading the project, but myself, Crystal, Jesse, Jen, Bridget, Andrew, and Abby are all on that team. And that's it for things that are happening in the office.
Thanks, Brittany. If there is nothing else, I will adjourn this meeting at 9:59 a.m. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.